Shalom everyone, you're here again with another episode of Tzol Mikra. I hope everyone's enjoyed the programs up to now. I've actually received some really good feedback, which is always nice, so thank you. And this week we are in Parashat Vayetse. The Vayetse comes from root Yatsa, which is to go out, to leave. And even before we actually go into the fact that Yaakov left, there's a few actual questions which are left open in regards to Yaakov's specific situation, especially when it comes to inheritance, because he's given the blessings, which basically give him more or less everything. But there's a legal issue here that he actually leaves home, which places him in a very problematic situation, because one of the things that we know is that if someone abandons the family structure, if someone runs away, they lose certain rights. Now, this is a story prior to the giving of the Torah, and the Torah doesn't really always go into specifics of certain situations, which means that there's a possibility that in Torah law there was also the common custom, the minhag, that people had at the time. And one of the things that we know, which was a common custom at the time, was that if a child, a son of a family, runs away from the family, runs away from the estate, the child has basically abandoned the family and therefore also given away or forfeited any rights, because the moment you run away from the family, the moment you leave the family, you have a technicality here of some kind of, I will call it rebellion or abandonment of the family, and therefore such a person will actually lose the rights. But to overcome this situation, Rivka actually comes up with a wonderful idea. She knows he has to run away, so she creates a sanctioned running away, which means he does not lose his rights. But then there's another question that's raised, which is we don't see in the storyline that Yaakov is seen as an inheritor of Yitzchak. I mean, later on in the stories, we see that Yaakov is referred to, it gives a blessing based on the name of Avraham and Yitzchak, specifically at the end of the story, the cycle story of Yaakov, where he gives blessings to his grandchildren and so on. And that's where we actually start seeing the strong link. The other thing as well is the fact that he also buries his father. Later on in the story, we see he buries his father, and that's one of the signs of still being a member of family. So I would say that the reason Rivka had to step in and sanction the running away, if we take, again, obviously this is not necessarily the only thing that we can say about this, there's always different angles, but just to give some context to the Bible, a possible explanation, I'm very careful with this because people run these days to look what we know from the ancient Near East and so on. It doesn't always necessarily answer the question, because we need to remember that this is written by Israelites, and their perspective of things does not necessarily have to be the same as the ancient Near East, as the rest of the people. And as Professor Shlomo Morag placed it, the Israelites had a very unique culture that we see how different it was from everyone else. So there is lots of evidence in language and in behavior and so on. But there are also things that, belong to the international scope of life, which everyone had to deal with. This is still a tribal system. This is still connected to unity through family and so on. But in any case, it's possible that she sanctioned the running away to prevent any situation. The fact that he buried his father means that he actually inherited, because another thing that we find in the ancient Near East was that if you inherit someone, it is your obligation to take care of them when they die. And this is also part of the concept of honoring your father and mother. One of the last honors a child does is bury the parents. This is part of the process, part of the honor that you give, even when the parent is not alive anymore. That's very quickly about the fact that he Yatsa, he had to go, he had to leave. But then there's a very interesting discussion. First of all, we have he travels. He's obviously traveling northwards, and he reaches this area that's named Luz, and then it's also named Bethel. This is actually by many scholars, this is a foundation story. It gives legitimacy to the existence of a temple in Bethel. And there's been a lot of attempts to try to find Jerusalem in the in the Torah, but it's really not that strong. And I'm not going to go into the whole discussion of the politics and so on that can exist from such a claim and debate. But it's very interesting that the Torah doesn't mention Jerusalem. It mentions places like Hebron and Beersheba and Bethel and even Dan, and these are all places which we know were cult centers, but then Jerusalem is not mentioned. We also have to remember that Jerusalem was not an important place until the times of King David. It was another city, but it wasn't important. And even more so, it really became internationally important during times of the Second Temple. And throughout the history of Jerusalem, Jerusalem was really a faraway place. I mean, for example, during the different Muslim rules of Jerusalem, they didn't really put any emphasis on the city. I mean, the whole upheaval today with Jerusalem is really something that's to do with politics, and it has nothing to do with Arabs really being interested in connection to Jerusalem. About 6 months ago, I did a whole course on the subject of Jerusalem. A very interesting thing that came up all the time about the Muslim eras is that they weren't interested. The only times anyone was interested was when there was politics involved. So when the Crusaders came, that's when they suddenly, Jerusalem is important. When Jews came back and became, a more powerful entity, now Jerusalem is important. That's basically what we're dealing with today. But really, what's interesting is Jerusalem is not mentioned anywhere. Even the name Shalem, it says V'yavo Yaakov Shalem, but it says Ir Shechem, which means that Shalem is somewhere nearby Shechem or is part of Shechem, and it also mentions Malkitzedek Melech Shalem. Again, it's not necessarily Jerusalem. Jerusalem actually is named in a very similar name to Yerushalayim in documents that we find in the ancient in Egypt, for example, because Egypt was heavily involved at this period. So the name Shalem is not a representative of the name Jerusalem. So there's a question here. But on the other hand, we have to remember this is pre-Jerusalem. The place was not chosen yet, and this is how Deuteronomy points it out. But in any case, he shows up in this place known as Bethel. And Beit is the construct state of the word house, and El is another way of saying God. So this is the house of God. So I think it's very difficult to ignore the very clear indication here of what's actually going on. So this is considered to be a foundation story, how a place like Bethel became so important. We have Har Moriah, which is a big question exactly where Har Moriah is. Again, we always have this whole thing that tries to center everything around Jerusalem, but there's really no evidence that Har Moriah is really in Jerusalem. It could be part of the area of Elon Moreh, which is more in Samaria. But the point is that we have stories that create foundation of sites based on revelation. So, for example, Yitzchak is in Beersheba, and he goes out to pray in the field. We have Avraham building altars in different places, but we also have Har Moriah, which becomes a place of worship because of the fact that there was revelation there. Bethel becomes a center of worship because of the revelation. Dan can become a place of worship because of the fact that there was a miracle there to one of the ancestors of the Israelites. So really, when it comes to the subject of Jerusalem, Jerusalem is a chosen place. Maybe I would say the chosen place. And it becomes the chosen place because it's now the chosen place by all of Israel. This is why Jerusalem overtakes all these sites, because it becomes the place that was chosen by God for all of Israel. Every one of the ancient sites had to do with an individual patriarch. And that individual patriarch had his own covenant there with God. But the moment it's a covenant with all of Israel, which is really the one that becomes the most important one at one point, because of the importance of Israel as a nation, as a continuation of the promise of the patriarchs, Jerusalem overtakes all the sites. And this is why Jerusalem is more important than any one of the other sites. But what's interesting is that there's a legitimacy that we find in the book of Genesis to all the other sites. And I've even heard scholars who say that really if you pay close attention, some of the earlier prophets, like Amos, don't really have a problem with the existence of a temple in Bethel. What they have a problem with is the idol worshipping. And the same thing, for example, Eliyahu. You don't find him refusing to sacrifice in Mount Carmel. More so, it mentions that there was a altar to God and he healed, he rebuilt the altar of God that was destroyed on Mount Carmel. Eliyahu doesn't have a problem with the existence of such a place. Elisha doesn't say anything about it either. It seems to be that the idea of a centralized place where no other place should exist became important when they realized the dangers of an existence of such other sites. But prior to that, the earlier stage, the earlier prophets, especially the prophets that we have stories from with story cycles, or the early written prophets such as Amos, the criticism it seems to be not on the existence of a site, but more on the existence of the idol worshipping there. So it's an interesting subject, the whole thing about the only Jerusalem and so on. And I think the only Jerusalem became really the final word of God when the northern kingdom was destroyed. And really the fact that the reason the northern kingdom was destroyed is because they got detached from the temple. They got detached from the chosen king of Israel. And the realization was that if you don't have one central place, then you can't really govern everyone. You need some kind of centralization. And this is why later on we start seeing how Jerusalem becomes really important, really central for everything, especially after the boost where even Assyrian chronicles admit to this, that Jerusalem wasn't conquered. Everything else was destroyed. I mean, the destruction is evident. We see this. We can see what happened in Lachish. We can see what happened in other sites as well. Lachish is a very, very important site for the study of the status of the land of Israel and Judea specifically during the times of the Assyrian conquest of 701 BC. And 20 years prior to that, the Samaria was conquered. Doesn't mean everything was destroyed, but Samaria was conquered. When you take the capital, you've taken everything. So the fact that Jerusalem wasn't conquered meant that they really didn't take anything. And even the Assyrian chronicles admit that he says, I caged Hezekiah, which is, I caged Izakiah, because they didn't really have a chet anymore at that point. The Gadaros were lost in Akkadian, or this is actually late Assyrian. But basically what happened there was they didn't conquer Jerusalem, therefore they didn't really officially conquer anything. And it raises the question why they conquered, but in the palace of Sancheriv, we actually see a conquering of Lachish and not of Jerusalem. I've had discussions with archaeologists where they claim that because Lachish was really the capital. No, Lachish was a secondary capital. This is something a lot of people aren't aware of. Lachish was a very important city, but it was also a secondary capital. The taking of Lachish was not the final word. It was easier to take Lachish because it wasn't in the mountains. So the Assyrians, like many other kingdoms, like for example the Battle of Kadesh, everyone tries to say, Egypt won, the Hittite won. Everyone's lying about what they actually did. So they emphasized the fact that they conquered Lachish because they were unable to conquer Jerusalem. But in any case, that victory turned Jerusalem into even more important in the eyes of many, many people, because it was the last standing city against this mighty army. And you need to understand, Judea was a tiny little country. And, the fact that they were able to stand against such a kingdom like Assyria, which was the most powerful entity at the time, is nothing short than a miracle. And everyone knew this. And this is why this really gave Jerusalem a boost. In any case, it's an interesting subject, the whole thing of Bethel versus Jerusalem and the whole story here of such a site. I will point out that there's also a lot of interesting discussions regarding what exactly is this ladder that he saw. So what is sulam? Yeah, repeat that, sulam. And it might be related to the Akkadian word similtu. And similtu basically means a flight of stairs. So there are a lot of people who say, what he saw was a ziggurat. Now, it's possible, because a ziggurat is considered to be like a stairwell to heaven. Babi'ilu, Bavel is really a corruption of the word Babi'ilu, which means Bab is or Babu is the word gate. To this very day in Arabic, the word for gate is Bab, and Ilu is another way of saying God. And the point is that some people say what he saw was a ziggurat. Now, if he saw a ziggurat or not is not the point, because the focus here is really on the stairs themselves. So even if he didn't see a full-fledged ziggurat with all its parts and so on, what he probably saw was a flight of stairs. And that's really the focus of the ziggurat, the fact that you have a flight of stairs that goes all the way up. And what basically happened there is the Bethel became a Bab Ilu, which basically became a center that's connected to the heavens. Bethel of today, I mean, there's a town known as Bethel it's really the land of Benjamin, but some people call it Samaria. That's not deep enough in the lands to become Samaria. But they see there's a site there now. It's very difficult to dig in the area because a lot of Arab villages were built there, so they never really found the official Beit El. There's a little site just outside of Beit El, the city. That's people call it Sulam Yaakov, the ladder of Jacob. I've been there. I did a video there once with a friend, with Keith Johnson, and it's an interesting site. But again, it's very difficult to pinpoint. I mean, it's a very common thing. Everyone tries to find the exact spot that something happened. It's not really that simple. Yaakov takes an oath, which I find very intriguing because he kind of puts a condition to God. I mean, you would think that Yaakov, living in Yitzchak's house and being the Yoshev Ohalim, the dweller of tents, would know about this faith, but he behaves almost as if he's never really met the God of Israel. He's never really met this God that his ancestors have discussed with him, and he makes this condition: and if you will be my God, I will do this, and I will do that. And he also takes this oath that he will take a tenth of everything and dedicate it to him, which is interesting. So to whom does he give it? And then there's the whole discussion that he becomes his own Kohen, he becomes his own priest as the head of the family, or he can nominate one of his sons to become a priest, and that's how he can develop such a mechanism. But there's a lot of conditional clauses here, and what's very interesting, for example, is that God says, Yaakov says, "Vaya Adonai li Elohim," and the Lord will be my God. Va'even azod, and this rock, Asher samti matzeva, and this rock which I placed as a pillar, Yeh bet Elohim, will be a house of Elohim. V'chol asher titeni, and all that you give me, aser aserenu lach. And everything they give me, I will take a tenth out of it. So we have the word maaser, which we've discussed before here in the recordings. So it's interesting that he creates like this other covenant, this new covenant, and and a new place of worship is created, which is not the same sites as his ancestors went to. And there's like this detachment to some degree. And maybe this detachment is connected to the fact that he's going into exile. So because he's leaving the land and he's going out to exile, he needs to create some kind of a new covenant with God that's separate from his ancestors. How this develops, I'm not too sure, but I'm just trying to throw out an idea there. In any case, so he goes to the area where his family originated from. He meets, as always happens, all romantic stories in the Bible happen next to a well. He meets Rachel, and we have two issues with the story. Two issues a lot of people bring up. First of all, the issue of polygamy, and second of all, the issue of bigamy. He marries two sisters. So, first of all, regarding polygamy, for the 9th bazillion time, the Tanakh has no problem with polygamy. The prohibition of polygamy is something that developed in the Roman Christian world, because in Rome, Romans and Greeks were monogamous. In the East, many nations were polygamous, and what happened was, at the moment Greeks came in contact with the East, some of Greek thought influenced the Eastern world, and some people started becoming monogamous. But really the idea of monogamy is a very Western idea. It comes from Greece, it comes from Rome. The Romans, especially after Christianity became a legitimate religion in Rome, emphasized the concept of monogamy, especially through women who wanted to have a monogamy with their husbands. The Romans were notorious for adultery like you wouldn't believe. I can't even go into describing how horrendous Roman society, especially high Roman society, how horrendous they were when it came to adultery. And we also need to understand that the early Christians, what's very surprising, some of the early Christians were Roman high society women. You have a lot of stories of women who belonged to the high society of Rome, and they were Christians, and they, as Christians who absorbed some of the Jewish values of not committing adultery and so on, had a problem with this. So they promoted the concept of monogamy, which the church accepted. Because remember, some of these women were some of the biggest patrons of churches. They helped build churches. So they actually influenced. Before Catholicism became this very masculine religion, some of the most important and most influential people in the Christian church were these rich women. So it seems to be that they influenced the churches to revoke the idea of polygamy. And this is why we start hearing today. I mean, I always hear this, especially from people in the West and from America, that a man is, if a man goes and lays with a non-married woman, that's also adultery. And by biblical law, it's not adultery. If a man goes and sleeps with another woman, she's some kind of a concubine or something. I'm not going to go into the definitions exactly. But we don't find in the Bible a prohibition on polygamy. However, it's important to point out that, first of all, in our culture, polygamy is not a good idea. I actually know a family that they had a case of polygamy, and it was a nightmare, number one. So, number two, there are limitations and so on. You have to have the financial ability to do such a thing. But in any case, I'm married, and believe me, I'm not interested in marrying another woman. It's really one of the things that they say is that one of the reasons people will marry more than one wife in the ancient world was because the other wife didn't have any children. There were several other reasons, but a very common reason that we find, for example, in Talmudic sources, because the Talmud itself, they just didn't say there's anything wrong with polygamy, but they realized the difficulty with such a thing, and they really tried to make sure that families stay in peace with one another. So one of the things that we find is that they kind of limited polygamy, the number of wives a person can have, and the reasons a person can marry another woman. And usually polygamy was more something that was done by people who actually had money, people who were wealthy. So it wasn't as widespread as you would think. So every time I hear these stories of these men from wherever who want to marry more than one wife, you have to go into this whole discussion of understanding the structure of it. They say, this is my right. Yeah, but there's other things. It's not that cut and dry. There's a few other elements that have to be taken into context here. The other thing is the bigamy here. He marries sisters. So this is a bit of a question when it comes to people who say, the Torah was known to them prior to this. And this proves that it didn't. They didn't, because this by Torah, by Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, this is completely forbidden. I don't know of too many cases. I mean, I've gone over marriage documents and laws in the ancient Near East, and I've never seen a situation where it describes anything about prohibiting marrying two sisters, and I've never seen anything about marriages that say that someone married a sister and so on. So there's a big question about this practice here. But what's very important to point out here is the fact that he married sisters, which is against the Torah, which shows that according to this story, the Torah was unknown to them. So then, if we stay in the same story, we have the whole discussion of when Rachel steals the family idols, which, for those who might not know, family idols in some cultures were a symbol of inheritance. So the theme of inheritance is very important in these stories. Who is the true inheritor? Esav, Yitzhak or Ishmael, Yaakov or Esav. Is it Yosef or is it Yehuda? This concept of inheritance goes through everything. And you can see that at the end of it, everyone is able to find their peace somewhere. And some people say that this was written as a theme by Moses to try to get the other tribes to realize that they can be together, they can be brothers and not fight one another because they're all favorable in the eyes of God. Yes, there are certain tribes which are more important than the others because of leadership and so on. But the stories are trying to show that the brothers can live with one another. Yitzchak and Ishmael both bury their father. Yaakov and Esav both bury their father. The brothers come to peace with Yosef. So there's this theme here of the inheritance, but the ability to find that place in reality where you can live side by side and not struggle with one another, which connects the whole thing of the struggle between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. the mentioning of Bethel as a chosen place to try and maybe soothe possible tensions of wanting to put the tabernacle somewhere else, and so on. There's a lot of these subtle messages that you might find inside the text. But in any case, we have information here about marriage itself, which will be a separate recording, which I'm planning on doing. Though I've done something about marriage, I want to do something more in this platform, and there's stuff that I've done in the past, but I rather focus on what I'm doing today. And what we have is another story that when she steals the family idols, she hides them underneath, hides them underneath the camel pillow. And when her father walks in, she says, "I'm sorry, I can't get up. Ki orach nashim li." Orach nashim basically means she's having her period. And there's this interesting interpretation that says, oh, that's because they also knew the prohibition of niddah. Now, this interpretation really stems from an interpretation that we find in the Midrash. In truth, laws of cleanliness and so on are usually in the circle of cult in most societies. With the Israelites, because of certain aspects of cult which can be done, which are done outside of the circle of the temple in some places, then the niddah has a bit more meaning than what you might find in other cultures. And again, I've been looking for laws of niddah in other cultures, and it's not that simple, because most of what we know are to do with legal terms and legal concepts. So a lot of people, based on this interpretation by the sages, by the Jewish sages, say that they knew the laws of niddah. Now, this is questionable, because we need to understand the historical understanding of the Jewish sages and how they saw things. Anyone in any period, even today, when people try to talk about things in the Bible, they interpret a lot of what's going on based on the current culture. So, for example, there's this sin that historians unfortunately commit. It's a sinful act when you're a historian, that they try to interpret something based on the reality they have at the time. So when people were talking about the spread of Rome, so some interpreted the spread of Rome in the ancient world based on the attempt of Germany to spread in different points in time, or if we're talking about Germany as Prussia, and so on, the interest that Prussia had in the 1700s to control parts of Silesia or Poland. So they say, oh, it's to do with their interest and so on. But then when you really start reading some of the documents from the period, you realize, oh, it's not exactly that. They were doing something a little different, and so on. So there's this problem that people interpret things based on the Zeitgeist, the common culture of the time, the spirit of the culture of the time. And the same thing with evolution. Evolution heavily influenced back when the theory came out. The evolution theory heavily influenced the way that people understood how the Bible came to be. And really, back in the 1950s, 1960s, Dr. Moshe Tzvi Segal kind of pointed this out. And he said one of the greatest sins of the early Bible scholars is this idea that everything was evolutionary. And therefore, they try to interpret how the Bible came to be through evolution. And that's obviously, it's not the right way to interpret things. So we need to understand that the sages at their time, especially after the influence of Persian culture, saw other nations, other cultures, especially ones who were influenced by the Persians, that they also kept the laws of niddah. So they said, they believe that niddah was a dangerous thing. We also have some issues of niddah which appear in Indian culture. I think the story is that some of the earlier stages of mankind in Indian stories is that men died, so the women accepted to have a period, which is a symbol of some kind of a death to bring a man back to life. There were some cultures that did have connections to the whole period and the cycle and so on. But by the point of this midrash, I would say that Persian influence on the way people understood things was very, very strong, and therefore they interpret this as being a recognition of the laws of niddah. But they also throw in this little twist in that people were afraid of the breath of the niddah because something to do with sorcery. But in any case, I don't see any evidence of this. All she's saying is that I'm having my period. That's all she's saying. and they didn't have all the hygienic tools that we have today. So the only option she had was to, when she knew she was going to have more of a flow, she had to sit on something that will absorb it. So she, use your imagination. So I actually don't see any evidence here that they actually cared about the laws of niddah. I think it's just something practical that she was having. That was the time of the month, and that's why she didn't get up. She didn't want to make everything, didn't want to make things dirty. So I'm really doubtful about this interpretation that she was having, that there was some issue here with the laws of niddah. Excuse me. The last thing I actually want to point out here is, first of all, there's all the cool names here, all the names of the brothers here and so on. And, I might do something on Facebook more about their names and explaining their names and so on. But then there's the whole discussion of what exactly did Jacob do to have all those animals? How did he cause all the animals to come into existence? And it's very interesting. One of the interpretations I saw reminded me of something I learned in high school about genetics. And one of the arguments is that Yaakov understood genetics. He actually kind of had working with the animals, he started realizing there's certain patterns that animals have. So he was able to figure out how to influence recessive genes. That he knew that there was a recessive gene hiding somewhere, and that recessive gene appears 25% of the time ish. This is one of the analysis that I've seen about this. And he basically knew how to take that recessive gene and basically turn it into a dominant gene. And that's how he knew how to create that point where he takes this small group of animals but then turns them into the majority. So there's a whole explanation here about him recognizing recessive genes and so on. But then a lot of people ask about, well, where's the deal with all these plants that he puts in front of them and so on. And that's actually one of the things that's left really open in the discussion about it. And some people say that there's some kind of attraction the animals have to these plants. Maybe there's some kind of substance in the plants themselves that cause them to mate more and so on. But really, everyone saw someone who tried to make the claim that there's an act like this to this very day that they would use. But he very clearly understood. The one thing I see is that he really clearly understood, very in depth, how animals behave and how their genes behave and so on. So there's it's a very, very interesting subject. But there have been papers written about the whole genetic study here and so on. I've tried to find some things. I've had some explanations put in front of me, but the plants themselves, to me at least, is still an enigma unless someone has a good explanation out there. And if you do, please let me know. It'd be awesome to hear. But in any case, they run away. You have to remember something here as well. There's always these little subtleties regarding the present time or the future. So it's interesting that Lavan really represents Aram. And by one point, Aram became one of the fierce enemies of the northern kingdom. So it's very interesting, the whole thing here, that Yaakov has to come in contact with Aram or with Lavan and then come back. And there's always this border dispute with the Arameans in the north. So it's interesting that they go to the mountains of Gilad and they actually put a barrier there between them, which is kind of a hint. I always interpret this as being kind of a hint to the Arameans that, with all due respect to your wills, our ancestors put this barrier, the Gal'ed, and also the Aramaic name Yagar Sahaduta. Sahad is an Aramaic word for testimony or witness. And it's like a hint to them, no, you're not supposed to cross this border. Yaakov also uses this term Pahad Yitzchak. And I've actually written something in my blog about the term Pahad Yitzchak, so I'm just going to repost it so people can reread that. But the Pahad Yitzchak is not the fear of Jacob. It's something a little different. In any case, a few points about this week's parasha. Hope you enjoyed this. Any questions or comments or ideas, You know where to find me, HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com. Hebrew in Israel is one word. And Shabbat Shalom.